She had chosen the trail precisely because it promised nothing dramatic. That, more than anything, was the point. At 47, Sarah Mitchell had grown wary of stories that advertised transformation or revelation. She no longer believed that meaning arrived with force. If it came at all, it did so quietly, through repetition, through long stretches of silence broken only by breath and footfall. The apartment felt smaller each evening. 8 months since the divorce papers were signed, and still the walls seemed to press inward. Not with hostility, but with a kind of patient insistence, as if the space itself understood she no longer belonged there. The marriage had ended the way old structures collapse, slowly, then all at once, not from a single catastrophic blow, but from the accumulated weight of small fractures neither of them had bothered to repair. Mark had texted that afternoon, "Hope you're doing okay." The words carried no malice, no hidden agenda, just the flat concern of someone who had once shared her life and now observed it from a safe distance. She had stared at the message for several minutes before setting the phone face down on the kitchen counter. There was nothing to say. They had exhausted language months before the lawyers became involved. Work filled the weekdays, though calling it work felt generous. She processed permits at a desk in the Forest Service regional office, far from the trails she had once walked with purpose. The demotion had been her choice, technically. After the divorce, she could no longer focus during backcountry patrols. Her mind would wander at critical moments. And in wilderness work, distraction could mean death. So she had requested reassignment, and her supervisor had obliged with the careful sympathy reserved for employees who are clearly broken but not yet ready to admit it. The packing began after dark. She moved through the process with the deliberate calm that came from 2 decades of ranger training. Each item earned its place in the backpack through utility alone. Wool-based layers that wicked moisture. A compact sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees. Dehydrated meals portioned for 3 days, though she planned to hike only 2. The stove, the water filter, the first aid kit, all the small instruments of self-reliance that had always steadied her when human connection failed. Her father's compass sat in a wooden box on the bookshelf. She lifted it carefully, feeling the familiar weight. A Kamenga tritium model, military issue, the kind that didn't require batteries or sunlight. He had carried it through Vietnam, through jungles where the canopy blocked the sky and magnetic north was the only truth worth trusting. When she was 12, he had taught her to navigate using just this tool and a topographic map. Trust your instruments, he had said, but trust your instincts more. He had been dead 3 years. Cancer had taken him slowly, methodically, the way it takes men who spent their youth breathing Agent Orange and pretending it didn't matter. She had sat with him through the final weeks, watching his body diminish while his mind remained sharp and cruel in its clarity. He never complained. He documented his decline with the same precision he had once applied to plotting coordinates in hostile territory. Near the end, he told her, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of being forgotten." She placed the compass in her jacket pocket. Beside it on the shelf was his trail journal from 1985. The year he had hiked the Cascade Mountain Trail alone, 3 months after Sarah's mother had left them both. The entries were sparse, technical, concerned mostly with elevation gain and water sources. But one passage had stayed with her. Good for clearing the head. Nothing dramatic, that's the point. She tucked the journal into her pack's outer pocket where she could reach it without stopping. Sleep came in fragments. She woke at 4, dressed in the dark, and drove north as the sky began to pale. The trailhead parking lot was empty. She had expected as much. Late October in the Pacific Northwest meant cold rain and early snow in the high country. Most hikers had already conceded the season to winter. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. She locked the car, adjusted her pack straps, and checked the trail register. The last entry was dated 5 days prior, a couple from Portland who had turned back after 6 miles due to mud. She signed her name, listed her expected return date, and stepped onto the trail. The forest welcomed her without ceremony. Towering Douglas firs filtered the morning light into long greenish shafts that fell across the path like stage lighting. The ground was soft with needles and decades of decomposed growth, a living carpet that muffled her footsteps. She noticed the small details she always noticed: moss thickening on the northern sides of trunks, the faint indentations where old wagon wheels had once cut into the earth, the way certain clearings held moisture while others stayed dry. These observations steadied her. They were proof that attention mattered, that careful watching could reveal patterns invisible to the careless. For the first several hours, the trail behaved exactly as expected. It rose gently through second-growth forest, curved around stands of ancient cedars, occasionally widened where logging equipment had once been dragged through. She stopped once to drink water and eat a handful of almonds, standing quietly as a gray jay hopped along a fallen branch nearby. Time stretched, then dissolved, as it often did when she walked alone. Her thoughts drifted toward work, toward the apartment she would return to, toward the carefully maintained distance between herself and everyone she had once considered close. Then those thoughts thinned and fell away entirely, leaving only the rhythm of breath and stride. Midway through the third hour, she noticed the survey stakes. They were new, bright orange plastic tags attached to metal rods driven deep into the ground. Each tag bore the same text: Hartwell Development, Preliminary Survey. She knew the name. Richard Hartwell was a regional developer with a reputation for aggressive land acquisition and minimal concern for environmental review. His projects typically involve transforming wilderness into gated communities marketed to retirees seeking rustic authenticity without actual discomfort. The stakes shouldn't have been here. This was state land, protected under wilderness designation protocols. Preliminary surveys required permits, environmental assessments, public comment periods. Either Hartwell was working far ahead of official approval, or he had found some legal mechanism to bypass the standard process. Neither possibility surprised her. Money had a way of smoothing regulatory obstacles. She photographed several stakes with her phone, noting their GPS coordinates. It wasn't her jurisdiction anymore, but the habit persisted. Document everything. Let someone else decide whether it mattered. She continued hiking, unease settling into her chest like a stone dropping into still water. The weather shifted just after noon. The light changed first, flattening rather than dimming, as though the forest itself had inhaled and forgotten to release the breath. A breeze moved through the upper branches, stronger than before, carrying the sharp scent of coming rain. She checked the sky through gaps in the canopy. Clouds had gathered where there had been none that morning, thick and low, pressing against the ridgeline. Weather in these mountains changed quickly. She knew that. The forecast had called for clear conditions through the weekend, but forecasts were predictions, not promises. She adjusted her pace, moving faster without hurrying, calculating distances and alternatives. The nearest shelter was marked on her map, a primitive lean-to maintained by the Forest Service, roughly 2 miles ahead. If the rain held off for another hour, she could reach it before conditions worsened significantly. The trail began to misbehave. It narrowed unexpectedly, split briefly around a massive boulder, then rejoined itself at a slightly different angle. Fallen branches obscured sections she remembered from her father's journal as clear and well-maintained. She slowed, scanning for the metal blazes that marked the official route. They appeared intermittently, sometimes 50 feet apart, sometimes missing entirely. Her father's journal described this section as straightforward. But 40 years had passed. Landslides reshaped terrain. Windfall created new obstacles. Trails migrated naturally, following the path of least resistance rather than the path surveyors had intended. She wasn't lost. Her compass and map gave her position with reasonable accuracy, but the distinction between knowing where you are and knowing where you're going can matter enormously when weather closes in. The first drops fell like a warning. She pulled on her rain jacket and cinched the hood. The wind strengthened, pushing against her from different directions as though testing her balance. Within minutes, the rain intensified from a drizzle to a steady downpour. Water pooled in depressions along the trail, turning the path into a series of shallow streams. She kept moving. The lean-to was close now, perhaps a mile, perhaps less. But visibility had dropped to 30 feet. The forest closed around her, uniform and disorienting. She stopped, turned slowly in a full circle, and admitted what her body had already known. She had lost the trail. Not catastrophically, not dangerously yet, but the certainty that had guided her steps for the past 5 hours had evaporated. She consulted the map, trying to match terrain features to contour lines, but the forest revealed nothing distinctive. One slope looked like every other slope. She checked her father's compass, confirmed north, and chose a direction that should intersect the trail within a quarter mile. Thunder rolled through the valley, low and sustained. Lightning followed, brief and brilliant, illuminating the forest in stark relief. She counted the seconds between flash and sound. 3 miles, maybe 4. The storm was moving toward her. Hypothermia was the real danger now. She was wet, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees in the past hour. Movement generated heat, but only if she kept moving. Standing still, even to think, invited the cold deeper. She needed shelter immediately. Through the curtain of rain she saw it. At first she thought it was a fallen tree, its bulk obscured by vines and shadow. But there was a geometry to it that stopped her. Straight lines where none should exist. Angles softened by time but not erased. She moved closer, heart beating with cautious attention rather than alarm. Wagon wheels emerged from the undergrowth, iron-rimmed and massive, half swallowed by soil and roots, moss growing thick across the lower spokes. Above them, a wooden frame extended forward and back, reinforced with heavy beams fitted together with a precision that spoke of careful craft. And rising from the frame, walls built of logs and planks, enclosing the original structure in a shell that had aged to the color of wet stone. This was not merely a wagon left to rot. This was a wagon that had been transformed, made permanent. Someone had taken a vehicle designed for movement and anchored it deliberately to this exact spot. The craftsmanship was evident even through the rain. The joints were tight, the roof pitched at an angle calculated to shed water. A small covered porch extended from the entrance, just large enough to keep rain from driving directly against the door. She stood there as the storm intensified, water running down her face, her breath visible in the cooling air. The forest pressed close around the structure, as if trying to reclaim it, but the thing itself endured. She felt the strange pull of recognition, the sense that she had stumbled upon something intentional, something shaped by need and thought and long patience. Whatever it was, it had not been meant as a temporary shelter. It had been meant to last. Wind howled through the trees, and another lightning strike hit close enough that she felt the air snap and tighten. The storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived. She took one last look around, committing the surrounding landmarks to memory, then turned her full attention to the structure before her. This door was solid wood, reinforced with iron hardware dulled by decades of weather. It did not hang open like doors on abandoned buildings she had seen before. It was closed, as though someone had left and intended to return. Her hand hovered inches from the latch. Even though reason told her that whoever had lived here was long gone, there were boundaries that persisted even after the people who set them disappear. Another gust drove rain sideways into her face. She was shivering now, her fingers clumsy with cold. Continuing to wander without a clear trail would be dangerous. Staying outside offered no shelter and no certainty. Entering meant crossing an invisible line, but it also meant warmth, safety, and time to think. She lifted the latch and pushed. The door swung inward on hinges that moved smoothly despite their age. The interior revealed itself gradually as her eyes adjusted from gray daylight to the dimness within. The air inside was dry, astonishingly so, carrying the faint scent of old wood and ash rather than dampness or decay. That alone told her she had not misjudged the place. Water had been kept out. The structure had held. The space was compact but carefully organized. The wagon's original curvature shaped the room, giving it a narrow, elongated feel, yet every inch had been used with clear intention. Along one wall ran a built-in bench with storage beneath it, the lid worn smooth by use. Opposite stood a small table, folded flat against the wall and secured with a simple latch. Shelves lined the upper sections, their contents neatly arranged, untouched by the chaos that typically follows abandonment. Nothing lay scattered. Nothing felt hurried. Her attention was drawn immediately to the stove. It sat near the center of the structure, compact but substantial, with a flue that disappeared upward through the roof. The metal was dark with age but intact, its surface bearing the marks of long use rather than neglect. She crouched beside it, examining the seams, the ash drawer, the vents. It was a sophisticated piece of equipment for its time, more refined than she would have expected in a frontier wagon. The flue pipe had been carefully routed, insulated where it passed near wood. Someone had understood the dangers of fire and had worked meticulously to prevent them. She recognized the design from her training, an Army Corps of Engineers field stove, the kind used in Civil War-era military camps. The craftsmanship was unmistakable. As she stood and turned slowly, absorbing the space, a realization settled over her. This was not simply a wagon repurposed as a cabin. It was an early form of mobile living, a self-contained system designed for movement and then adapted for stillness. The thinking behind it felt modern despite its age. Someone had solved complex problems with limited resources and achieved something both functional and permanent. The storm outside pressed harder. Wind rattled the structure's outer walls, but inside there was only a muted echo of that violence. She closed the door behind her, tested the latch. It held firm. The sense of intrusion softened, replaced by cautious gratitude. Whoever had built this place had done so to endure storms exactly like this one. She was not violating its purpose by seeking refuge. She was fulfilling it. She began a more careful exploration, moving slowly, touching nothing at first, simply noting. Hooks were set into the walls for hanging tools or clothing. A narrow bunk folded down from one end of the wagon, its frame sturdy, its mattress long since gone but the shape unmistakable. Beneath it, drawers slid open smoothly, revealing folded fabric that crumbled at her touch, reduced to dust by time. The care with which they had been stored made their fragility more poignant. Near the stove, she noticed markings carved into the wood. Not decorative, but practical. She leaned closer and saw faint writing, partially obscured by soot. These were technical notes, instructions written by someone who knew that memory alone was unreliable. She could make out fragments. Damper angle 45 degrees Nova wind. Secondary vent closed during storms. Check flew monthly. These were not graffiti or casual observations. They were operating procedures left behind by someone who intended for this system to work long after they were gone. Her pack felt suddenly heavy. She set it down near the door and shrugged out of her wet jacket, shaking off as much moisture as she could. The interior temperature was cool, but stable, not the biting cold of the forest. She imagined what it must have been like to sit here during a winter storm, the stove glowing, the walls holding fast while snow piled against them outside. The thought carried both comfort and an unexpected weight. Someone had trusted this place with their life. Someone had believed that careful preparation and sustained effort could create safety in a landscape that offered none naturally. And they had been right. The structure had endured for what appeared to be well over a century, waiting. She returned to the stove, kneeling again, this time with intention rather than curiosity. If she was going to stay the night, and the storm gave her no alternative, she would need heat. The temperature was dropping, and her wet clothing was leaching warmth from her core. Hypothermia could set in within hours if she didn't act. She opened the stove door carefully. Inside, remnants of old charcoal lay fused together, preserved by the structure's dryness rather than any deliberate care. She brushed some aside, creating space. From her pack, she took a small fire starter and a bundle of kindling she always carried. Habit ingrained by her father, who had taught her that preparation was the only insurance worth having. Before striking the spark, she studied the flue one more time. Smoke would have nowhere to go if the chimney was blocked. In a space this confined, that could be fatal. She traced the pipe with her eyes and then with her hand, following it upward to where it disappeared through the roof. There were no obvious cracks, no gaps where smoke might leak back into the room. Still doubt lingered. Confidence untested by reality was little more than hope. She knelt and struck the spark. The flame caught quickly, licking at the kindling with small, hungry movements. For a moment, she allowed herself relief. Then the smoke began to thicken, curling upward and then hesitating, as if unsure where to go. It pooled beneath the ceiling, spreading outward, stinging her eyes and making her cough. She moved quickly, opening the door to let fresh air rush in. Wind tore at the opening, dragging rain inside and sending the flames sputtering. She extinguished the fire and leaned back against the wall, breathing hard, frustration rising like nausea. The storm outside was growing louder, more insistent. She had minutes, not hours, to solve this. Without heat, she would be forced to spend the night in wet clothing, risking hypothermia despite the shelter. The structure that had seemed like salvation now felt like a trap with slightly more comfortable dimensions. She forced herself to think methodically. The stove design was sound, the flue appeared intact. The problem had to be blockage or airflow. She reread the carved instructions, this time more carefully. One line mentioned adjusting vents based on wind direction. Another referenced a secondary intake that needed to be opened during certain conditions. She found the lower vent the instructions mentioned, partially hidden beneath soot buildup. It was closed completely. She opened it. Then she located the damper mechanism inside the stove and adjusted it to the angle specified for northwest wind, which was the direction the storm was coming from. When she struck the spark again, the flame caught and held. Smoke rose, hesitated for only a moment, then was drawn upward decisively into the flue. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The system was working. Someone more than a century ago had tested this stove in countless conditions, had documented what worked and what didn't, and had left that knowledge carved into the wall for whoever came next. She fed the fire slowly, adding small pieces of wood she found stacked neatly in a bin beside the stove. The wood was old but dry, preserved by the same conditions that had kept the structure intact. As warmth began to spread through the space, she felt her muscles begin to relax, the tension draining from her shoulders and neck. She changed into dry clothes from her pack, hanging the wet ones near the stove, but not close enough to create a fire hazard. As circulation returned to her fingers and toes, she allowed herself to sit on the bench and simply breathe. The storm outside had reached its full intensity now. Rain hammered the roof, wind screamed through the trees, sirois. Lightning illuminated the small window in brief, stark flashes. But inside, the wagon house held. The walls absorbed the blows without complaint. The roof did not leak. The stove continued to draw steadily, carrying smoke and danger away. She noticed a small wooden box on one of the shelves. Inside were hand-carved animals, a horse, a bear, a bird. They were simple but skillfully made, the kind of objects created during long evenings by someone with time and a sharp knife. She held the horse, feeling its smooth surface, and wondered who had made it and for whom. Her eye caught more writing on the wall near where she sat. This carving was different from the technical notes. These were initials, followed by numbers that looked like dates. JS 1867. Below that, MS. And smaller, as though added later, ES 8 years and TSN 6 years. A family had lived here. The realization came quietly without drama. A father, a mother, 2 children. They had measured the children's growth against this wall the way families everywhere marked door frames with pencil lines and dates. This place had not been a desperate refuge or a temporary camp. It had been a home. She rose and moved to the built-in bench, noting the craftsmanship. Dovetail joints at the corners, mortise and tenon construction, every piece fitted with the precision that came from skill, not accident. Beneath the bench, she found a toolbox. The wood was scarred and stained, but the contents were organized with military exactness. Chisels arranged by size, a hand plane, a square, a level. She lifted the toolbox carefully. On the bottom, burned into the wood with what looked like a branding iron, were words: Captain J. Sullivan, 3rd Engineer Regiment, U.S. Army. Captain Sullivan, Union Army, Corps of Engineers. The man who had built this place had not been an ordinary pioneer. He had been a soldier, trained in construction and fortification, accustomed to solving problems under pressure with limited resources. He had applied military engineering principles to civilian survival and created something that outlasted him by generations. She searched further and found a small leather case tucked behind the toolbox. Inside was a daguerreotype, the image faded but still discernible. A man in uniform stood beside a woman in a simple dress. 2 children sat at their feet, a girl and a younger boy. The man's face was stern but not unkind. The woman looked tired, her shoulders slightly hunched as though bearing invisible weight. The children stared at the camera with the solemnity common to early photography, when subjects had to remain motionless for long exposures. This was the Sullivan family. She studied their faces, trying to imagine the circumstances that had brought them to this place, that had convinced Captain Sullivan to stop moving and start building. What had happened to them? Why had they left? Or had they? A drawer beneath the bench pulled open with some effort. Inside, she found papers. Letters, she realized, stacked and tied with a faded ribbon. The top one was dated May 15th, 1867. The handwriting was precise, the kind taught to military officers who needed to write clear reports under field conditions. She hesitated before reading. There was a boundary here, an intimacy she was about to violate. But the storm gave her no choice except to sit and wait, and the alternative to reading was simply staring at walls. She untied the ribbon carefully and unfolded the first letter. Margaret's condition worsens. The doctor in Portland is 80 miles distant, and she cannot endure such a journey. We must remain here through winter. I have decided to fortify this position using core techniques. The children require shelter, and shelter requires permanence. What began as temporary refuge must become something more deliberate. I will not fail them, as I have not failed my men. The voice that emerged from the page was steady, factual, almost clinical. Captain Sullivan wrote the way engineers document construction projects, listing problems and solutions without embellishment. But between the lines, Sarah detected something else. A quiet desperation, a man making impossible calculations with insufficient data and deciding that action, any action, was better than paralysis. She read the next letter, dated June 3rd, Eastern, 1867. This one detailed construction decisions, roof pitch tested at 35 degrees, proved insufficient during a heavy rain. He had rebuilt it at 42 degrees. No leaks now. The stove required a specific angle for the flue to account for prevailing winds. He had experimented with 3 different configurations before finding one that worked consistently. The third letter from July 1867 was shorter. Emma asked why we cannot live in town like other families. I told her pioneers must be self-reliant. She replied, "But Papa, you built bridges for generals." I said, "And now I build a future for you and Thomas." She seemed to accept this. Thomas said nothing, as is his nature. Sarah set the letter down and closed her eyes. Emma and Thomas, the names on the wall, children who had lived here, slept here, grown here, measured against walls that still stood while their lives had long since ended. She thought of their father carving those measurements, documenting their existence with the same precision he applied to stove angles and roof pitch. Outside, the storm continued its assault. She checked her watch. Nearly midnight. She had been inside the wagon house for 6 hours, and already it felt less like a discovery and more like an inheritance. She was not the first person to shelter here in crisis. She would not be the last, assuming the structure continued to endure. But she might be the first in a very long time to understand what Captain Sullivan had built and why. The fire needed tending. She added wood, adjusted the damper slightly as the wind shifted direction. The system responded exactly as the wall instructions predicted it would. Smoke drew upward without hesitation. Heat radiated steadily. She understood now why the structure had survived. It had been designed by someone who understood that survival in harsh environments required not just shelter, but systems. Not just walls, but methodology. She pulled her sleeping bag from her pack and spread it on the bench. It was too short to lie flat, but she could curl up comfortably enough. Before settling in, she read one more letter, this one from August 1867. Margaret's decline accelerates. I must make an impossible decision soon. The children cannot winter here if she succumbs. But leaving her alone is unthinkable. I find myself calculating probabilities the way I once calculated bridge load capacities. How much weight can a marriage bear? How much grief can children endure before their structure fails? I have no equations for this. The letter ended there. Sarah refolded it and placed it back with the others. She lay down in her sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, where shadows from the stove's firelight danced and shifted. The storm hammered on, but inside there was only warmth and the faint smell of wood smoke and old timber. She thought about her own marriage, about the slow erosion that had seemed invisible until the structure finally gave way. Mark had not been cruel. She had not been wronged in any way that allowed for clear grievance. They had simply worn each other down through the accumulated friction of 2 people trying to occupy the same space without a shared direction. By the end, separation had felt less like failure and more like necessary surgery, painful but ultimately the only way to prevent further damage. Captain Sullivan had faced different circumstances, but similar impossibilities. Whatever had happened to his family, it had involved choices no decent person should have to make. She wondered if he had blamed himself afterward. She wondered if he had found peace or simply resignation. Sleep came in fragments. She dozed, woke to tend the fire, dozed again. Each time she woke, she noticed something new about the structure. The way moonlight, when the clouds briefly parted, fell through the window at an angle that suggested the opening had been positioned deliberately. The way certain boards had been left rough while others were plain smooth, indicating which surfaces bore weight and which did not. The way every detail, down to the smallest peg and notch, spoke of someone who believed that precision mattered, that care compounded over time into permanence. Toward dawn, the storm's voice shifted. The rain softened, though the wind remained restless. She sat up, stiff and sore, and stared at the stove where embers still glowed faintly. The first night had been survived, not through luck, but through design. Sullivan's design, implemented more than a century ago, still functioning exactly as intended. She felt gratitude not just for shelter, but for the mind that had created it. As pale light began to filter through the window, revealing the aftermath of the storm, she understood that the wagon house had offered more than a protection from weather. It had offered her a mirror, a way of seeing her own life reflected in choices someone else had made under impossibly different circumstances, yet somehow familiar pressures. The trail she had lost no longer mattered. The route she had planned was irrelevant. This place had found her, or she had found it, and the distinction felt meaningless. What mattered now was understanding what it meant and what, if anything, she was supposed to do with that understanding. Morning arrived without announcement. The quality of light changed first, gray becoming less opaque, shadows gaining definition where before there had been only uniform darkness. Sarah woke to silence so complete it felt like pressure against her eardrums. The storm had exhausted itself sometime in the hours before dawn. She lay still for several minutes, reluctant to disturb the equilibrium she had achieved with the sleeping bag in the hard bench beneath her. Her body had molded itself to the discomfort, finding rest despite conditions that would have seemed impossible in her apartment. Perhaps that was the difference between wilderness and civilization. In the wild, your body remembered how to settle for good enough, while civilization trained you to expect comfort you didn't need. The stove had burned down to ash. She rose stiffly, joints protesting, and began the process of rekindling heat. This time the system responded without hesitation. She had learned its rhythms, understood which vent to open first, how much kindling to use, when to add larger pieces. The knowledge felt earned rather than inherited, though in truth Captain Sullivan had done the difficult work of discovery. She was merely following his documented instructions. While water heated for coffee, made from grounds she had packed, she conducted a thorough inventory of her supplies. 3 days' worth of food, though careful rationing could extend that to 4. The water filter worked efficiently. Her first aid kit remained intact. The PLB beacon sat in the bottom of her pack, its activation button covered by a protective cap. She could trigger it at any time, summon rescue, explain that she had been caught in the storm and required extraction. Pride kept her from reaching for it. Pride in something else she couldn't quite name. A reluctance to end this unexpected vigil, to return to the world of permits and parking lots and text messages from people who cared about her in careful, measured doses. She checked the trail conditions from the doorway. Devastation greeted her. Trees had fallen across what remained of the path. The creek she had crossed yesterday, barely ankle deep then, now ran brown and swollen, carrying debris in its turbulent current. Mud had claimed sections of trail entirely, transforming them into slick channels that would be treacherous even in dry conditions. She estimated 48 hours minimum before attempting to hike out would be safe rather than merely possible. The distinction mattered. Possible meant you might succeed or you might die trying. Safe meant the odds favored survival enough that attempting it qualified as reasonable rather than reckless. 2 more nights then, 2 more days in this structure that had already begun to feel less like a shelter and more like a collaboration with someone long dead. She turned her attention to the wagon house itself, studying it with the systematic approach her father had taught her for assessing structures in backcountry. Load-bearing elements first. The wagon frame served as the foundation, massive timbers that had once been engineered to carry tons of cargo across unforgiving terrain. Sullivan had reinforced critical stress points with additional bracing, had anchored the wheels to prevent shifting even as the ground around them settled and compressed. The walls showed evidence of iterative improvement. Certain sections had been rebuilt, their boards newer than others, though still ancient by any reasonable measure. She could trace Sullivan's learning curve in the wood itself. Early attempts that worked but showed inefficiency, later modifications that achieved the same result with less material and greater elegance. This was engineering through practice rather than theory, knowledge earned through failure and refinement. She found herself moving through the space differently than she had the previous night. Then she had been a guest, tentative and grateful. Now she moved with something approaching proprietary interest, noting where water stains on the ceiling suggested a historical leak that had since been repaired, where the floorboards showed wear patterns indicating traffic flow, where storage had been positioned for optimal weight distribution. The bench she had slept on concealed more than she had initially realized. She knelt and examined its construction more closely. The seat lifted on hinges that moved smoothly despite their age, revealing a storage compartment lined with cedar to repel moisture and insects. Inside were items wrapped in oilcloth, practical preservation that spoke to Sullivan's expectation that whatever he stored here would need to endure. She lifted one bundle carefully. The cloth crackled slightly as she unwrapped it, revealing more letters, these tied with a different ribbon, darker and more worn. The dates on the top letter indicated September 1867, picking up where the previous correspondence had ended. Before reading, she conducted a more thorough examination of the bench itself. The compartment appeared to extend the full length of the structure, yet the bundles occupied only half the available space. She reached into the shadowed rear section, fingers exploring blind, and felt something unexpected. Not cloth or paper, wood, shaped and smooth. Her hand closed around it and withdrew a small box, perhaps 6 inches square, made of what looked like walnut and fitted with brass corners that had tarnished to dark green. It was heavier than its size suggested. She placed it on the table and studied it before opening. No lock secured it, only a simple latch. She lifted the lid. Inside, nested in fabric padding, were items that made her breath catch. Gold coins, 12 of them, bearing dates from the 1850s and early 1860s. Each one represented significant value then and would be worth considerably more now. Beneath the coins, a woman's wedding ring, simple gold band, worn thin on one side from years of wear. A locket containing 2 daguerreotypes so small she had to squint to make out the faces. Emma and Thomas, younger than in the family portrait, perhaps 4 and 2. Tucked beneath the locket was a folded document. She opened it with exquisite care. Land deeds, she realized. 320 acres in Oregon Territory, filed under the Homestead Act, bearing the name James Sullivan and dated March 1867. Official stamps and signatures covered the bottom portion, lending it the weight of legal authority. Also in the box, Sullivan's military discharge papers, honorable service rendered, signed by officers whose names she vaguely recognized from Civil War histories. And one more item, a surveyor's map, hand-drawn with the precision she had come to expect from the captain, showing topographical details of the land surrounding the wagon house, notations of water sources and game trails, calculations of optimal routes for various purposes. She sat back on her heels, understanding, crystallizing. This was not a cache of forgotten possessions. This was insurance. Sullivan had hidden his family's most valuable items, their proof of ownership and identity, in a place he believed would endure. He had bet on the permanence of his own work, had trusted the wagon house to outlast whatever circumstances had driven him to such measures. The ethical weight of the discovery pressed against her chest. These items belonged to someone, presumably descendants of the Sullivan family if any existed. Taking them would be theft, legally and morally. Yet leaving them here risked their loss to time, weather, or the next person who stumbled upon this place with less scrupulous intentions. She photographed everything methodically, documenting the box's contents and position. Then she returned the items exactly as she had found them, closed the lid, and placed the box back in its hiding spot. The letters, however, she kept out. Reading them felt like a lesser violation than disturbing the physical artifacts. Words were meant to be shared, even if their intended audience had died generations ago. The first letter from this new batch, dated September 12, 1867, began without preamble. A wagon train passed through today, heading west to Portland. The captain, a man named Morrison, agreed to take Margaret and the children with them. The journey will be difficult for Margaret, but remaining here through winter would be fatal. I have made the necessary arrangements. They depart at dawn. When the handwriting remained steady, but Sarah could sense the fracture beneath the words. Sullivan wrote the way soldiers wrote battle reports, documenting horror in clinical language, because acknowledging the emotional truth would make it impossible to continue functioning. The next letter, dated that same evening, was shorter. Emma wept when I told her. She begged to stay. I explained that staying meant watching her mother die, that going meant the possibility of survival. She asked if I would come soon. I said yes. Thomas said nothing, only held his wooden horse tighter. Margaret understands the necessity, but cannot speak of it. We said our farewells tonight, as tomorrow will allow no time for sentiment. I have failed them in every way except the one that matters most. I am sending them toward life. Sarah set the letter down. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls too close. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the forest where morning light now filtered through the canopy. Somewhere out there, 157 years ago, a woman and 2 children had left this place, walking away from the man who had built it for them, carrying only what they could manage and the uncertain promise that he would follow when he could. The subsequent letters tracked Sullivan's solitude through the autumn and winter of 1867. October brought the first snow. He documented temperatures, wind patterns, the performance of the stove under various conditions. He hunted deer and elk, smoked the meat, tallied his food stores with accountant precision. He repaired sections of the roof damaged by ice accumulation. He carved the wooden animals she had found, admitting in one letter that the activity kept his hands busy while his mind wandered to Portland, to Margaret and the children, to questions he could not answer. November's correspondence grew terser. Supplies adequate. Health good. Weather severe but manageable. No word from Portland, nor did I expect any. Mail service does not extend to unincorporated wilderness. I write letters to Margaret that I cannot send, describing my days as though she were merely in the next room, rather than 80 miles distant through mountains that have already claimed several lives this season, according to rumors from passing trappers. By December, the entries had shortened to brief technical notes. Successful hunt, stove modification proving effective, roof holding against snow load. Then, on Christmas Day, a longer passage. Made small gifts for Emma and Thomas from scraps of wood and leather. Foolish, perhaps, as they will never receive them. But the act of creation provided comfort. I carved a horse for Thomas, painted its mane black the way he prefers. For Emma, a small box with a fitted lid, lined with fabric from Margaret's dress, which she left behind as too heavy for travel. I imagine their faces upon receiving such gifts and find I can breathe easier for a moment. Sarah thought of the wooden animals on the shelf, the box she had seen in the storage compartment. These were not random objects. They were proxies for love that had no other available expression. The winter months brought few entries. January passed with notes about temperatures, occasional wildlife sightings, inventory updates. February mentioned a supply crisis averted when a cache of dried apples he had forgotten about turned up under a floorboard. March brought the first signs of spring and a shift in tone. The snow recedes. Trails that were impassable become merely difficult. I have decided to attempt the journey to Portland within the month. I will take the survey map, the deed, and enough supplies for 2 weeks. The wagon house will remain, a monument to the winter we survived separately. I find myself reluctant to leave it, this structure that has been companion and fortress both. But Margaret and the children must know I have not abandoned them, that the separation was always meant to be temporary. The next letter, dated April 3, 1868, contained words that made Sarah's hands tighten on the paper. Accident during roof repair. Fell from the ladder, landing poorly. My left leg is broken below the knee, the bone at an angle that suggests clean fracture but significant displacement. I have set it myself using techniques learned in field medicine, splinting with boards and securing with strips torn from bedding. The pain is considerable but manageable. What concerns me more is infection risk and the certainty that I cannot walk, much less hike, 80 miles through mountain terrain. She read the letter twice, then continued to the next, dated 2 weeks later. Fever has developed, confirming my fears about infection. I have treated the wound with such antiseptics as remain in my medical kit, changing the dressing daily, maintaining cleanliness as best I am able. The fever rises and falls. In moments of clarity, I understand that my options have narrowed considerably. I cannot reach Portland in this condition. I can only hope that the leg heals sufficiently to allow travel before summer ends. May brought a series of increasingly fragmented entries. The handwriting deteriorated, became shakier, though the content remained lucid. He described delirium during the worst fever periods, hallucinations of battles he had fought years before, conversations with Margaret that evaporated upon waking. He documented his treatment protocol with scientific detachment even as his body failed him. The final letter bore a date of June 3, 1868. The script was barely legible, letters drifting across the page like debris on water. The fever has broken. I am weak, thinner than I have ever been, but my mind is clear. The leg has healed poorly. I set it without proper tools or assistance, and the angle is wrong. I can stand, barely, with the aid of a crutch I fashioned from a tree branch. Full weight bearing remains impossible. I must attempt the journey regardless. Every day I delay is another day Margaret believes I have abandoned our family. I will leave at first light tomorrow, carrying only essentials. The wagon house I entrust to whoever finds it next. May they use it as I have, as shelter, as hope, as proof that careful work endures beyond the lives that create it. The letters ended there. No further entries, no postscript, no indication of what happened next. Sarah sat in silence, holding the final page, reading and rereading those last words. The wagon house I entrust to whoever finds it next. The phrasing suggested intention, a deliberate passing of responsibility across time. Sullivan had believed someone would come eventually, would need what he had built, would honor it by using it. She returned to the wooden box, lifted it again from its hiding place, and examined the deed more carefully. The land claim covered 320 acres with boundaries that, according to Sullivan's survey map, extended north and west from the wagon house location. If those boundaries were accurate, and she had no reason to doubt Sullivan's surveying competence, then a significant portion of the area where she had seen Hartwell Development's survey stakes fell within the original homestead claim. The legal implications took shape slowly. Homestead claims required continuous occupation and improvement for 5 years. Sullivan had filed in March 1867, had occupied and improved the land through at least June 1868, 14 months. Had he returned? Had he died attempting to reach Portland? Had Margaret and the children ever known what became of him? Her phone showed no signal, but she checked it compulsively anyway. The battery was down to 40%. She powered it off to conserve what remained. When she eventually made it back to civilization, the first thing she would do was research Sullivan family records, find out what had become of Margaret, Emma, and Thomas. A sound from above interrupted her thoughts. Not wind or rain, ich bin nicht durning, but something more immediate. A crack followed by a creaking groan that vibrated through the structure's frame. She froze, listening. Another crack, sharper this time, then a wet thud against the roof directly overhead. She moved to the door and looked up. A large branch had broken free from one of the surrounding trees, weakened by the storm, and finally surrendering to gravity. It had struck the roof at an angle, fortunately not with enough force to penetrate, but the impact had dislodged several shingles. Even as she watched, water began to seep through the gap, running down the interior wall in a dark stain. The damage was fresh, actively worsening. Left unrepaired, the leak would compromise the wood, invite rot, begin the process of destruction that the structure had so far resisted. She calculated her options. Ignoring the problem meant watching Sullivan's work begin to fail, meant potentially spending another night in conditions that would deteriorate rapidly. Fixing it meant climbing onto a wet, sloped roof with improvised tools and no backup if something went wrong. The choice presented itself with brutal simplicity. She could preserve what Captain Sullivan had built, or she could let it begin to die. She searched the storage compartments systematically, finding exactly what she needed because, of course, Sullivan would have maintained repair supplies. A bundle of wooden shingles, cut and stacked decades ago but still sound, nails in a tin container, hand-forged iron that had oxidized on the surface but remained strong underneath, a hammer with a worn handle, a small pot of pine tar for sealing seams. She tied a length of paracord from her pack to the sturdiest section of the wagon frame, creating a safety line. It wouldn't prevent a fall but might slow one enough to matter. Then she climbed carefully onto the roof, using the same ladder Sullivan must have used, the one that had betrayed him in April 1868. The surface was slick with moisture from last night's rain and morning dew. She moved slowly, testing each foothold before committing her weight. Wind tugged at her jacket. The damaged section lay approximately 8 feet from the edge, accessible but requiring her to cross the steepest section of pitch. She belly crawled, distributing weight, fingers finding purchase on ridges and gaps between shingles. When she reached the damaged area, she assessed the problem properly. 3 shingles had been knocked loose, and the branch impact had cracked 2 more. Water was entering through the piece, following the path of least resistance down into the wall cavity. Working methodically, she pried out the damaged shingles and fitted new ones from Sullivan's supply. The wood was aged, had shrunk slightly, required adjustments to fit snugly. She used the knife from her pack to shave edges, making each piece conform to its neighbors. The nails drove cleanly, the iron still capable of biting into century-old timber. Halfway through the repair, a gust of wind stronger than the others caused her to flatten against the roof, hard hammering. The paracord safety line pulled taut, holding firm. She waited for the wind to subside, breathing carefully, aware that fear could be as dangerous as the actual risk. When calm returned, she continued working. The final shingle required particular attention. It needed to overlap its neighbors precisely to maintain the water-shedding pattern Sullivan had engineered. She fitted it, adjusted it, refitted it, testing the alignment until satisfied. Then she applied pine tar to the seams, sealing gaps that would otherwise admit moisture over time. Only when the repair was complete did she allow herself to look at the surrounding forest from this elevated perspective. The view revealed what ground level had obscured. The wagon house sat in a slight depression, positioned to avoid the worst wind while still maintaining drainage. The trees around it were old growth, their canopy providing shelter in summer and a windbreak in winter. Sullivan had chosen this location with the same precision he had applied to every other aspect of construction. She descended carefully, every movement controlled, and didn't relax until her feet touched solid ground. The repair had taken 2 hours. Her hands were raw, her legs shaking from the sustained tension of working on a sloped surface. But the roof no longer leaked. Water no longer ran down the interior wall. She inspected her work from inside, checking for drips. None appeared. The patch was holding. The structure would endure at least a while longer because she had acted rather than merely witnessed its deterioration. Something had shifted during those hours on the roof. She understood now, in a way that reading Sullivan's letters had not fully conveyed, what it meant to maintain this place. It required constant attention, an ongoing commitment to preservation that could not be delegated or postponed. Sullivan had done this work alone for at least 14 months, had climbed this same roof in worse conditions, had driven these same nails and sealed these same seams. And one day he had fallen. The ladder had shifted, or his grip had failed, or simple chance had intervened. The leg had broken, infection had followed, and his journey had ended here or somewhere between here and Portland. She thought about her own life, about the marriage that had ended not from catastrophe, but from accumulated neglect. What might have been preserved if she had been willing to make repairs when damage first appeared? What structures had she let deteriorate because the work of maintenance seemed too difficult or unrewarding? The questions had no comfortable answers. She returned to Sullivan's letters instead, reading them again with the understanding that came from having touched the same wood he had touched, having solved the same problems he had solved, having looked at the same forest from the same vulnerable height. His final entry haunted her. I will leave at first light tomorrow. Had he made it out of sight of the wagon house before collapsing? Had he died on the trail, his body lost to weather and scavengers, his crutch discarded somewhere in the endless forest? Or had he, against all reasonable odds, reached Portland, been reunited with his family, lived out his days knowing that the wagon house stood empty, waiting for someone who needed it? The answer mattered less than she had initially believed. What mattered was that Sullivan had tried, had pushed forward despite injury and fever, and the mathematical certainty that his chances were poor. He had refused to accept that building the wagon house would be the last significant act of his life. Outside, afternoon lights slanted through the trees at new angles. She realized she had been inside for nearly 12 hours without interruption, absorbed in letters and repair work and contemplation. Her body demanded movement. She stepped out into the clearing, breathing deeply, letting her muscles unknot. The forest smelled different now, cleaner somehow, scrubbed by rain and renewed by the storm's violence. Everything looked sharper, more defined. She walked the perimeter of the wagon house, noting details she had missed in yesterday's downpour. The way water channels dug into the ground directed runoff away from the foundation, the strategic placement of stones to prevent erosion, the careful management of vegetation to maintain airflow while preserving natural windbreaks. This was engineering at its most fundamental. Not bridges or fortifications, but the patient application of knowledge to the problem of survival. Sullivan had taken principles learned in military service and translated them into domestic architecture, had created something that served no strategic purpose except the strategy of living through winter. She found herself wishing she could thank him. Not in the abstract way one appreciates historical figures, but directly, personally, the way you thank someone who has done you a specific kindness. The wagon house had saved her life, or at least made survival through the storm significantly more probable. It had also given her something less tangible but equally necessary, a framework for understanding that endurance was its own form of heroism, that building could be an act of love even when the people you built for were gone. As evening approached, she prepared for a second night. The routine felt established now, rather than improvised. She knew which wood burned best, how to adjust the damper for changing wind, where to position wet gear for optimal drying without fire risk. The wagon house had become familiar, almost comfortable. She read more letters by the stove's light, these the unsent correspondence Sullivan had written to Margaret during the winter months. They were heartbreaking in their mundane domesticity. He described his daily routines, asked questions about Emma and Thomas, offered advice about matters he could not possibly influence from 80 miles away. In one letter, he apologized for the separation, then crossed out the apology and wrote instead, "I will not apologize for choosing your survival over our togetherness. Some decisions transcend regret." That line stopped her. Some decisions transcend regret. She thought about her divorce, about the guilt that had shadowed her, even though logic insisted she had done nothing wrong. Maybe the point was not to eliminate regret, but to recognize that some choices were necessary despite the pain they caused. She slept better the second night, her body having adjusted to the hard bench, her mind having accepted the wagon house as temporary home rather than emergency shelter. When she woke the third morning, the forest was silent again, the storm's aftermath now simply the new normal. She checked the trail conditions and found them improved but still dangerous. One more day, she decided. One more day to ensure safe passage, to finish reading Sullivan's letters, to prepare mentally for the return to civilization and all the complications that would follow. Because she understood now that she could not simply leave this place and forget it. The wagon house, Sullivan's story, the question of what had become of his family, these were responsibilities she had inherited the moment she opened that door. She had become the next person Sullivan had written about, the one entrusted with his work and his memory. The weight of that trust felt surprisingly welcome. The third morning brought clarity in more ways than one. The sky had deepened to sharp blue, scrubbed clean by 3 days of weather. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through the window at an angle that told her she had slept past dawn for the first time since arriving. Her body had finally surrendered to the exhaustion accumulated over 72 hours of vigilance. She lay still, listening to the forest wake around her. Bird calls she recognized from ranger training, varied thrush, Steller's jay, the distant drumming of a pileated woodpecker. These sounds meant the storm's disruption had passed, that the natural order was reasserting itself. It also meant conditions would allow her to leave today if she chose. The thought brought unexpected resistance. 3 days ago, she would have welcomed extraction, would have activated the PLB beacon without hesitation. Now the wagon house felt less like a trap and more like an intermission, a pause between acts of a life she wasn't certain she wanted to resume. But supplies were finite. The trail would only deteriorate further with each passing day, and she had responsibilities that extended beyond personal comfort. Before packing, she conducted one final systematic search of the structure. She had read all the letters, documented the hidden valuables, understood the basic architecture. But Sullivan's methodical nature suggested there might be more. Additional caches, further documentation, tools or information stored in places she hadn't thought to examine. She started with the rafters, using the ladder to inspect the space between roof and ceiling. Dust and cobwebs met her probing fingers initially, then something more substantial. Rolled paper tied with twine wedged into the gap between two support beams. She worked it free carefully, afraid the aged material might crumble at rough handling. On the table, she unrolled what proved to be Sullivan's survey map. Not the small version in the wooden box, but a full-scale working document nearly 3 feet across. The detail was extraordinary. Every creek and ridge within a 5-mile radius had been plotted with precise measurements. Elevation changes were marked in careful notation. Game trails, water sources, patches of edible plants, areas prone to flooding. Sullivan had documented the entire landscape with the thoroughness of someone planning a campaign. But what caught her attention were the boundary markers. The homestead claim's perimeter was drawn in red ink, a rough rectangle encompassing the wagon house and extending outward. Sullivan had noted corner points, had provided compass bearings and distances that would allow anyone with basic surveying skills to walk the property lines. She pulled out her phone, powered it on despite the battery warning, and opened the GPS mapping function. Using Sullivan's coordinates as reference points, she plotted the homestead boundaries onto the modern topographic overlay. The match was imperfect. Surveying technology had improved considerably in 157 years, but close enough to reveal something significant. The survey stakes she had photographed on her first day, the ones marked with Hartwell development tags, sat squarely within Sullivan's original claim. Not near the boundary, not in disputed territory, but well inside the mapped perimeter. If Sullivan's homestead had been properly filed and maintained, the land would never have reverted to state ownership. It would still belong to his heirs, whoever they might be. She photographed the survey map from multiple angles, capturing every notation and measurement. Then she rolled it carefully and wrapped it in a waterproof stuff sack from her pack. This document was evidence, potentially the key to preventing Hartwell's development from destroying not just the wagon house but the entire landscape Sullivan had claimed and improved. The wooden box presented an ethical problem she had been avoiding. Leaving it here risked loss or theft. Taking it meant removing artifacts from their historical context. She compromised by documenting everything exhaustively, photographs of each item in place, detailed written descriptions, measurements, condition assessments. Then she wrapped the box in multiple layers of protection and placed it in her pack. When she reached authorities who could properly secure it, she would hand it over immediately. The letters she treated with similar care, creating a complete photographic record before wrapping them in waterproof material. Sullivan's words deserve preservation as much as his physical legacy. Her final act before departing was to write a note explaining what she had found and what she had taken. She placed it in a plastic bag and left it prominently on the table where anyone entering would see it immediately. The note included her contact information, the date, and a detailed inventory. If anyone challenged her later, at least she would have documented her intentions. She stood in the doorway one last time, looking back at the space that had sheltered and changed her. The stove sat cold now, the fire she had maintained for 3 days reduced to ash. The bench where she had slept looked smaller than it felt during the nights. The walls that had seemed so substantial revealed themselves as simply wood and intent, matter organized by human will, into something that could resist entropy for a while. Thank you, she thought, directing the words towards Sullivan, though she knew the gratitude extended to the structure itself, to the accumulated wisdom embedded in its construction. Then she stepped outside, secured the door behind her, and faced the forest. The alternate route Sullivan's map suggested involved following a ridgeline that paralleled the main trail at higher elevation. According to his notations, this path avoided several creek crossings and provided better drainage, making it more passable after heavy rain. The trade-off was steeper grades and one significant obstacle: a ravine that required crossing a natural bridge formed by a fallen tree. She found the ravine within an hour. The tree was exactly where Sullivan had marked it, a Douglas fir that had toppled decades ago and lodged between rock outcrops on either side of a 25-foot gap. Below, the creek that had carved the ravine rushed white and violent, swollen with runoff. The tree appeared stable, its trunk thick enough to walk across if one had balance and nerve. Sarah had neither in abundance at the moment. Her legs were fatigued from 3 days of limited movement, her core strength compromised by sleeping on a hard bench. The backpack threw off her center of gravity. Wind gusted unpredictably through the ravine, strong enough to make her sway even standing on solid ground. She could backtrack, try to find the main trail despite the flooding and fallen timber. That would add at least 6 hours to her journey, possibly more, and guarantee hiking in darkness. Or she could cross here right now while daylight and determination remained. The paracord became a safety line again. One end tied to a sturdy tree on her side of the ravine, the other end clipped to her pack's frame. It wouldn't prevent a fall, but it might keep her from being swept away if she landed in the water. She tested the tree trunk's stability by standing on it near the edge, bouncing slightly. The massive log barely moved. She began crossing. The bark was wet but provided texture for grip. She moved sideways, feet perpendicular to the trunk's length, hands pressed against the wood for balance. Don't look down became a mantra. Her father had taught her that vertigo was psychological, that the inner ear could be fooled, but physics remained constant. Focus on the destination, not the void. Halfway across, the wind hit harder than before. She dropped to her knees, then to her stomach, hugging the trunk while the gust tried to peel her away. The paracord pulled taut, then slack, then taut again as she shifted position. Below, the creek's roar filled her ears, drowning out thought. When the wind subsided, she crawled forward. No dignity in it, no grace, just determination and the friction of wet wood against her jacket and pants. The far side seemed impossibly distant, then suddenly close, then beneath her hands as she scrambled onto solid rock. She sat there for several minutes, breathing hard, waiting for her heartbeat to settle. The crossing had taken perhaps 3 minutes. It felt like an hour. The rest of the hike passed without incident. The ridge trail descended gradually, rejoining the main path near a familiar landmark, a distinctive boulder shaped like a breaking wave. From there, she knew the route precisely. 2 more hours brought her to the trailhead parking lot where her car waited, dusty and ordinary, and deeply welcome. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel as though it were an artifact from a foreign civilization. The digital clock on the dashboard read 4:47 p.m. Sunday. She had entered the forest Friday morning, 3 days that had reorganized her understanding of what mattered and why. Her phone showed 53 missed calls, most from her mother, several from the Forest Service, 3 from Mark. She ignored them all and dialed a different number, one she found in her contacts under Dad's friends. Frank Garrison answered on the second ring. His voice carried the rough edges of a lifelong smoker who had quit too late to prevent damage. "This is Frank." "Frank, this is Sarah Mitchell, Jim Mitchell's daughter." A pause, then, "Sarah, Jesus. Your mother's been calling everyone, said you were missing on the Cascade Trail." "I wasn't missing. I was delayed by weather. Frank, I need to talk to you about something I found." "You sound strange. You okay?" "I'm fine, better than fine, but I need help with something historical, something that might involve land rights and preservation." Another pause, longer this time. "This about that Wagon house?" Her breath caught. "You know about it?" "Know of it? Never found it myself, but your dad and I used to talk about the Sullivan legend, Civil War engineer who supposedly built a house from a wagon somewhere in the Cascades. Most rangers figured it was bullshit, tourist trap story that got embellished over the years. It's real, Frank. I spent 3 days in it." "I'll be damned. You at the trailhead now?" "Yes. Stay there. I'm 40 minutes out. Don't talk to anyone else until we figure out what you've got." He arrived in 35 minutes, driving a battered Jeep that had clearly seen decades of backcountry use. He was smaller than she remembered from her father's funeral, stooped slightly, but his handshake was firm and his eyes sharp with the particular alertness of men who had learned to assess situations quickly. "You look like hell," he observed. I feel like I've been living in the 19th century. Show me what you found. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through photographs, the Wagon house exterior, interior details, Sullivan's letters, the survey map, the hidden box contents. Frank studied each image carefully, occasionally zooming in on specific details, his expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching wonder. This is authenticated Civil War correspondence. These tools are period appropriate. This surveying work? He trailed off, shaking his head. Your dad would have lost his mind over this. He was obsessed with Sullivan's story. He never mentioned it to me. You were young when he got interested. Later, after you became a ranger, I think he wanted to let you make your own discoveries. But he spent years looking for this place. Hiked every trail in the Cascades trying to find it. Never did. The revelation landed with unexpected weight. Her father had walked these same forests seeking the same structure, had failed where she had succeeded through simple accident. She wanted to believe it meant something, that his search and her discovery were connected by more than coincidence. But she settled for the simpler truth. She had been lucky where he had been thorough, and luck mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. There's a complication, she said, and explained about the Hartwell Development Survey stakes, about the homestead boundaries that appeared to overlap with proposed development areas. Frank's expression hardened. Richard Hartwell, that son of a bitch has been trying to develop this area for 5 years. Keeps getting blocked by environmental reviews, keeps finding new angles. If there's a valid historical claim to this land, it would stop him. It would at least slow him down, but we'd need proof that Sullivan's homestead was properly filed and maintained. That claims from 18th, a lot can happen in 157 years. I have the deed, the original with filing stamps. Then we need to verify it against county records, see if the claim was ever formally abandoned or if Sullivan's heirs maintained ownership. He pulled out his own phone and started typing. I know someone at the County Historical Society, Dr. Helen Park. She's good, discreet, knows property law better than most lawyers. Let me set up a meeting. The call took less than 5 minutes. Dr. Park agreed to meet them that evening at her office, said she would pull whatever historical records the county had on homestead claims in the Cascade region. Frank gave Sarah directions to the Historical Society building, told her to get food and coffee first, that she looked like she might collapse otherwise. She followed his advice, stopping at a diner near the county seat. The food tasted strange after 3 days of dehydrated camping meals and the single energy bar she had eaten on the hike out. She forced herself to eat slowly, to drink water, to let her body adjust to normal caloric intake. The Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on a quiet street lined with similar structures. Dr. Helen Park met them at the door, a woman in her mid-50s with gray-streaked hair and the slightly abstracted manner of someone who spent most of their time in archives. Her office was cramped with filing cabinets, bookshelves sagging under the weight of local histories, and a desk buried under documents awaiting cataloging. She listened to Sarah's account without interruption, taking notes in precise handwriting. When Sarah showed her the photographs, Park's professional composure cracked slightly. This is extraordinary. The preservation state alone. Structures from that era typically don't survive without continuous maintenance. The fact that this has endured suggests exceptional construction quality. Captain Sullivan was a Corps of Engineers officer, Sarah said. That explains the technical sophistication. May I see the original deed? Sarah unwrapped the document carefully and laid it on the desk. Park examined it with gloved hands, holding it up to the light, checking the paper quality and ink consistency. This appears authentic. The filing stamps are correct for the period. The signatures match other documents we have from the same county clerk, but she paused, frowning. This presents a problem. According to our records, there is no active Sullivan homestead claim in the Cascade region. When a claim goes unimproved or unoccupied for 7 consecutive years, it reverts to territorial or state ownership. That happened with most frontier homesteads after the original claimants died or moved on. So the land belongs to the state now? Possibly, but if we can establish that Sullivan or his heirs maintain the claim, even symbolically the situation becomes more complex. We'd need to trace his family line, determine if there are living descendants, research whether they ever formally relinquished ownership. Frank leaned forward. How long would that take? Weeks at minimum, possibly months. Genealogical research isn't quick, especially when the primary sources are scattered across multiple archives. We don't have months, Sarah said. Hartwell Development is already surveying the area. Frank said they have been pushing for permits for years. Park nodded slowly. Richard Hartwell. Yes, I'm familiar with his work. He tends to operate in legal gray areas, technically compliant with regulations but ethically questionable. If he's already conducting preliminary surveys, that suggests he believes the land is unencumbered by private claims. Or he knows about Sullivan's claim and is hoping to develop before anyone challenges it, Frank suggested. That's certainly possible. Park turned to her computer and began typing. Let me check the county database for any recent permit applications or land purchase filings related to that area. The search took several minutes. When Park turned the monitor toward them, Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Hartwell Development had filed a request to purchase mineral and development rights for approximately 400 acres of state-owned land in the Cascade Mountain region. The filing was dated 2 weeks ago. The parcel description, when cross-referenced with Sullivan's survey map coordinates, showed significant overlap. The county board is scheduled to vote on this next month, Park said. If they approve, Hartwell will have the legal right to begin development. The fact that there's a historical structure on the property might not matter if the county doesn't know it exists. We need to file an emergency historical designation, Sarah said. Get the Wagon house protected before the vote. Emergency designations require evidence of significant historical value and imminent threat. We have the threat. Hartwell's development plans provide that. But the significance claim would be stronger if we could establish a direct connection between the structure and known historical events or figures. Frank's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned, then showed the screen to Sarah. A text from a colleague at the Forest Service. Hartwell crews on Cascade Trail today, building access road off old logging route. Thought you should know. The timeline was collapsing. Hartwell wasn't waiting for permits to be approved. He was preparing infrastructure, positioning himself to begin work immediately upon receiving authorization. If the Wagon house sat anywhere near his planned development, it would be destroyed or relocated without regard for historical context. I need to go back, Sarah heard herself say, document everything properly, conduct a full site survey, establish the exact coordinates for the historical record. You just spent 3 days out there, Frank objected. You're exhausted. Then come with me. Bring equipment, witnesses, whatever we need to make this official. Park considered the proposal. If I could send a team, myself, a surveyor, perhaps someone from the state archaeology office, we could conduct a preliminary assessment. That would give us grounds for requesting an emergency preservation order. How long to organize a team? A week minimum. These things require permits, liability insurance, coordination with the Forest Service since it's on federal land. We don't have a week, Sarah said. The certainty in her voice surprised her. Hartwell's already moving. By the time we get official permission, he could have equipment on site. Frank rubbed his face, exhaustion evident in the gesture. Sarah, even if we went back tomorrow, what could we actually accomplish? We can't stop Hartwell from building a road. We can't physically protect the structure. No, but we can document it so thoroughly that destroying it becomes legally complicated. We can establish a paper trail that proves we knew about it, reported it, requested protection. We can make it expensive for him to bulldoze history. The three of them sat in silence, considering options that all seemed inadequate. Finally, Park spoke. There is one other possibility. If we could locate Sullivan's descendants, establish that they have a legitimate claim to the land, we could challenge Hartwell's permit application on grounds that he's trying to purchase property he doesn't have the right to buy. How would we find descendants, Sarah asked. Start with census records, death certificates, marriage licenses. Sullivan mentioned his wife Margaret and children Emma and Thomas in the letters. If we can find what became of them after he sent them to Portland, we can trace their family line forward to the present. Frank was already pulling out his phone again. I know a genealogist who owes me favors. Retired Forest Service, spends his free time building family trees for fun. Let me call him. The genealogist, whose name was William Barrett, agreed to begin research immediately. Park provided him with the information from Sullivan's letters: full names, approximate ages, the date they left for Portland, the wagon train, captain's name. Barrett promised preliminary results within 48 hours, more complete findings within a week. In the meantime, Park said, I'll file a notice with the State Historic Preservation Office alerting them to the wagon house's existence. That won't stop Hartwell, but it creates an official record, and I'll reach out to colleagues who might be able to expedite the emergency designation process. Sarah felt the momentum shift, felt the discovery transform from personal experience into bureaucratic procedure. Part of her welcomed the help, the expertise, the resources she couldn't provide alone. Another part mourned the loss of intimacy, the way institutions would inevitably reduce Sullivan's story to categories and forms. But this was what preservation required. Not romantic gestures, but methodical documentation. Not individual heroism, but collective effort sustained over time. If the wagon house was to endure another 157 years, it would need more than good construction. It would need legal protection, public awareness, and the persistent advocacy of people who believed some things were worth saving, even when saving them was inconvenient. Frank drove her back to her car. During the 40-minute turn, he told her stories about her father she had never heard, training exercises that had gone wrong, close calls on backcountry patrols, the quiet competence that had earned Jim Mitchell respect from Rangers half his age. He talked about Vietnam, about shared experiences that had bonded them in ways civilian life never quite replicated. Your dad would be proud, Frank said, as they pulled into the trailhead parking lot, not just of finding the wagon house, but of what you're doing now, following through, making it matter. I'm just trying to honor Sullivan's work. Same thing Jim tried to do, honor the people who built things that lasted. He paused, then added, call your mother, she's worried sick. Sarah promised she would. After Frank drove away, she sat in her car making the calls she had been avoiding. Her mother answered instantly, relief and anger competing in her voice. 4 days, Sarah, 4 days without contact. I'm sorry, I got caught in a storm, lost the trail, found shelter. I'm fine. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, her mother cycling through emotions while Sarah provided reassuring noises without fully engaging. When it finally ended, she checked her other messages. Several from coworkers expressing concern. One from her supervisor asking her to confirm she would be back at work Monday. 3 from Mark, each more worried than the last, culminating in, just let me know you're alive, please. She replied briefly, I'm safe. Sorry for the worry. Talk soon. She didn't drive home immediately. Instead, she returned to the Historical Society, where Park was still working despite the late hour. The historian looked up from her computer, surprised. Did you forget something? No. I wanted to help with the research, if there's anything I can do. Park gestured to a chair. Actually, there is. I'm cross-referencing census records from Portland in the 1870s, looking for Margaret Sullivan and her children. If you could help me search through these digitized records, we might find them faster. They worked side by side for 3 hours, scrolling through page after page of handwritten census forms, searching for familiar names. The work was tedious, but oddly meditative, each page a window into lives long concluded. Sarah found herself wondering about all the other stories buried in these records, all the other Captain Sullivans whose histories had been reduced to a line in a ledger. At 11:23 p.m., Park made a sound of discovery. Here, Margaret Sullivan, age 41, widow, living in Portland in 1870, occupation listed as seamstress. 2 children, Emma, 12, and Thomas, 10. They made it. They survived. Sarah leaned over to see the screen. There they were. The family Sullivan had sent away to save. 3 names on a census form, proof that his decision had worked, that they had reached safety and built new lives. The entries included no mention of James Sullivan, no indication he had ever joined them. Can we trace them forward? Sarah asked. We can try. If Emma or Thomas married, there would be records. If Margaret remarried, same thing. Death certificates, property transfers, any legal documents would give us breadcrumbs to follow. They searched for another hour before exhaustion forced them to stop. Park promised to continue the research tomorrow, to call Sarah the moment she found anything significant. As Sarah finally drove home through empty streets, she thought about Margaret and Emma and Thomas building a life in Portland, while James Sullivan tried and perhaps failed to reach them from 80 miles away. Some separations were temporary. Others became permanent, despite everyone's best intentions. The difference often came down to nothing more than chance. A moment of inattention on a ladder, a piece of rotten wood that gave way, a fever that spiked at exactly the wrong time. Her apartment felt smaller than ever when she finally unlocked the door. She dropped her pack, showered away 4 days of trail grime, and fell into bed without bothering to unpack. Sleep came instantly, deep and dreamless, the kind of sleep that follows not just physical exhaustion, but emotional resolution. She had found something that mattered. Now she had to figure out how to protect it. The research consumed the next 3 days. Park called Monday morning with news that she had found Emma Sullivan's marriage record. She had wed a man named William Morrison in 1878, had taken his name, had lived in Portland until her death in 1932. The marriage record listed her father as James Sullivan, deceased, confirming that he had never returned to his family. By Tuesday, Barrett the genealogist had traced Emma's line forward through 4 generations, eventually identifying a living descendant, Catherine Sullivan Weber, age 82, residing in Seattle. Park made the initial contact, explaining in carefully chosen words that a structure possibly built by Catherine's great-great-grandfather had been discovered in the Cascade Mountains. Catherine's response came via email that evening. "I'm coming down tomorrow. Don't let anyone touch anything until I see it." She arrived Wednesday afternoon, a tiny woman with Emma Sullivan's bone structure visible in her face, carrying a folder of family documents Sarah recognized even before Catherine opened it. Emma had kept everything: her father's letters from the war, his survey tools, his commission papers, and most importantly, a diary Emma had maintained during the winter of 1867 to 68. "My grandmother told me about the Wagon house," Catherine said, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. She said her grandfather built it to protect them, that he stayed behind when they went to Portland. She spent her whole life wondering what happened to him, whether he died trying to reach them or simply chose not to come. "He tried," Sarah said, and showed her the final letter from June 1868. Catherine read it silently, tears running down her face. When she finished, she looked up at Sarah and said words that would shape everything that followed. "Then we finish his journey. We bring him home, even if it's only his story."